It has never left a good impression on my mind. And those slogan-like words had never exerted a deep influence on readers. But actually, her expulsion was not only because of her factional affiliation. She further presents a different picture of this event in an open letter, liquidation. Some scholars also consider it a pseudo-autobiography. Superficially, it is a letter to her husband announcing their divorce. Her husband was a communist, so the narrative audience should be her husband, but her husband was in prison at the time and could not read this letter. So the flesh and blood audience are people who bought this magazine and read this letter. But actually, the ideal narrative audience were people who paid attention to her political stance, because unlike her essays written when she was a communist, Liquidation was published in a magazine that tended to select works of old artistic writers and had distinguished itself from ultra-leftist journals that preferred young, aggressive writers who focused on ideological debates. By choosing a neutral literary magazine to expose her emotional struggles, she, to a large extent, alienated herself from past communist comrades and showed an inclination to the non-socialist group. In this letter, she records that she lost all energy because of love, but the people in charge blamed her for being too emotional and stated that giving up responsibility for love was incorrect and said that her lifestyle was not good. She rejected this kind of accusation in this letter and said that she had no idea why she should feel shameful and be criticized to such an extent just because emotions that were natural responses to what had happened to her. In the same year, she also published a short story, Abandonment. The female protagonist in this story, Shan, is a mirrored image to her. Both of them were trained at the military academies, is or was a communist, went to Shanghai for revolution, and lived in poverty with their husband and had a daughter. Towards the end of the short story, Shan and her husband left their daughter in a dark corner of a street. They had no money to raise the baby, so the baby must be abandoned for the sake of revolution. And the revolutionary ideal left the young parent with no choice but to love fellow class members instead of their daughter. Xie also wanted to abandon her daughter and commit suicide because of poverty at the time. But in her writing, she said that the baby's need for her saved her life several times, and she was completely maintained by a kind of maternal love during these difficult times. So although Shan's story is kind of a mirrored reflection of the author's own experiences in many ways, the mother-daughter relationship between the two revolutionaries differs. In Shan's story, with the communist aim of the great class struggle, not only heterosexual love, but even maternal idealization risked being regarded as sentimental. Based on the two articles, the central issue was to distinguish unnecessary emotions from those necessary for communist revolution. As the Chinese Communist Party gradually considered class struggle as the singular meaningful focus for revolutions, private and familial love was denounced as a bourgeois line that would be hostile to revolutionary zeal. The author was kind of tortured by these so-called emotional problems, and that might be one reason she revised her autobiographies later. The period covered by the war diary, namely the time when she was in the military academy and went to the front, is also included in her 3 autobiographies. And these works all cover this period of time, so they constitute an interesting intertextual relationship. The first one introduces her story from her childhood to how she escaped from an arranged marriage from her feudal mother. The second one includes the first one, but extends it to her later life, such as her studying in Japan, the death of her mother, and her participation in the war of resistance. The third one is a revision based on the second one, but more than 100,000 words were deleted and many pieces were modified. I compared some pieces of the 3 autobiographies as listed here. As we can say, many pieces have been deleted in later versions, and some pieces have been modified, and the textual length of the same story could be varied. In her first autobiography, for example, she read ABC of Socialism, an introduction to socialism. She supported the working class and the students' movement. In fact, the first autobiography is more factual because it, to a large extent, corresponds with her diaries. But the author tried to conceal her leftist thoughts in her later autobiographies little by little. And then the image of a girl soldier was gradually purified, not so much engaged with ideologies. In addition to that, an open letter she wrote to the girls' team when she was at the military academy is also included in War Diary, but it was also revised and republished in Taiwan in a new collection. Almost 70 years after the Northern Expedition, it was renamed A Letter from Half a Century Ago. As we can see here, a predominant feature is that class discourses have been replaced by national discourses. Comrade was changed to students. The party and the people was changed to our lives were given to the country and the nation. In non-fictional narratives such as autobiography, if two works by the same author differ in certain facts, corresponding inconsistency may be regarded as a sign of unreliability. But the problem in our case is, are these inconsistencies a betrayal of her past, of her memories? We need to consider the 20th century in China as a whole, and consider the values that were current during the period when a specific text was written. All three of her autobiographies were written during the turning point of the generation. For example, the full-scale war between Japan and China started in 1937 and lasted 8 years, a time when all parties left aside their hatred and united together for national salvation and independence. Her second autobiography was finished in 1946. At that time, she was expecting for a united China. But after Japanese was defeated, the civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party started. Although the Nationalist Party went to Taiwan, they did not give up the ambition to counterattack mainland China. Then the Cold War swept the world when she wrote the third autobiography. So from the perspective of author-reader relationship, the latter narrative, with its intertextual ellipses, renders the narrator more agreeable to current readers. She wanted, for example, readers not to be diverted by the revolutionary slogans and leftist slogans, but focus on the stories about a brave girl who loves her country. She transformed her early life by the demands of the present situations and social ideal. The government in Taiwan does not pay much attention to the peasantry and the working class and is hostile to the Chinese government. So as ideological standards vary from one social historical context to another, it can be very embarrassing to represent the past faithfully. In a shame culture, writers desire to maintain the good public image or avert the threat of social disapproval may lead to various kinds of subjective suppression and transformation of the past experiences. However, Xie Bingying's revision of her past autobiographies cannot be attributed entirely to the censorship of any political party. The removal of ideological discourses is a choice made by herself when she was no longer interested in political struggles. Keeping these realities violates her present self and is going to bring her more trouble. For example, the government in mainland China used her wartime works for patriotic propaganda. However, patriotism does not emerge from a public education on the political obligations to citizens. She told these worries to her friend in many correspondences, so deleting all of the leftist discourses might be better for her self-presentation. She also found her past definition of enemies and friends in class struggle problematic. Her unpleasant encounters with urban workers and some peasants changed her positive attitude towards them. For her, it has been no longer sensible to love people unconditionally simply because of their class traits. And a feudal mother and a modern daughter are not enemies so long as they love each other. So in her later life, she had a chance to expand the scope of writing to write travelogues, Buddhist stories, and to reconcile with her past self. In traditional Chinese autobiographies, credibility rests on an impersonal stance that keeps distance from subjectivity. But for Xie Bingying, it rests rather in a personal voice that frees from the mission of remembering. Thank you.